So welcome to the first lecture of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard for this year. My name is Lawrence Lessig, and I'm the director of the center and a professor of law here at the law school. For those of you within the center's family, you're no doubt a little bit shocked at the relocation of the lectures from the Kennedy School of Government to the law school. For as you know, like Mother Teresa, we like to live among the most wretched. But alas, the wretchedness of government last year got a bit too extreme even for us, and so we decided to move to a new space where we might have a little bit more effective influence, and that's the law school, which has now become the institutional home for this university interfaculty initiative. And 124 Mount Auburn Street is the new physical home for the center, and all of you will be invited to an event on the 6th of October to introduce our new space and to meet the new research fellows in the Safra lab who are focusing on the question of institutional corruption. Now, last year, this lecture series introduced the work of the Safra lab through 8 talks on the question of institutional corruption. These lectures, I think, were enormously successful in seeding a community at Harvard of people with a strong interest in studying and working to resolve the problems of institutional corruption. But this year, the work of the lab moves inside the center, and the public lectures return to a more traditional balance. As well as the lecture this evening by Tim Scanlon, we'll hear from Charles Fried, Jan Elster, Barbara Herman, and Josh Cohen. Only one lecture in this series will return directly to the question of institutional corruption. That's a lecture by Congressman Jim Cooper, a Blue Dog Democrat from Tennessee, who will speak about the issue of campaign finance reform. Now, this balance captures, well, I think, the balance of the current center. At its core, the center continues the study of a wide range of ethical issues with a wider range of perspectives, perhaps. The graduate fellows continue to be an essential part of the life of the center, feeding the work of this more traditional focus. And so our hope is to draw in the widest range of Harvard community into the mix of questions that this center helps address, both traditional and the more recent. Now, it's against that background that I'm very happy to have the chance to welcome our first speaker, Tim Scanlon. Tim is the Alford Professor of Natural Religion, Moral Philosophy, and Civil Polity at Harvard. He received his BA from Princeton and his PhD from Harvard, and first taught at Princeton before returning to Harvard in 1984. 3 years later, Tim joined Dennis Thompson and others in forming what was then called the Program in Ethics in the Professions. He was then, as I was told, instrumental in defining the values and spirit of the center, and I remember in my own year at PEP a decade ago, he was clearly a core influence in the ideals of that center. This year is the first year in which the governance of the center is not partly in his hands. Tim served on the faculty committee from 1987 until this past summer. And so we welcome him tonight, not just to hear more insight from the core of philosophy at Harvard, but also to thank him for 23 years in working to make this center as important and as salient as it has become. He is, we could say, the last of the old guard, but despite his stepping down from a formal role at the center, we will continue to depend upon him to set the frame for our work going forward, and that's what he does tonight, launching this lecture series this year and welcoming us back to the work of the center. So please join me now, not just in welcoming Tim to give his lecture, but more importantly to thank him for the work he has done for the center over the past 23 years. Tim.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. And is this too loud? Somebody else control that, I guess. Thanks to the center. The center has been an enormously important part of my life for the last 23 years. It's been a source of continued intellectual interest, a chance to connect with people across a range of subjects who were still interested in a common question, and I certainly don't want to leave it behind in any respect. My lecture today is about the relation between moral philosophy and political philosophy. Now, it might sound as if that's a question that would only be of interest to designers of university curricula. But in fact, I think it involves interesting questions of more than merely academic interest, and I'll try to persuade you that this is the case. I'm also going to say something about corruption. I didn't know this wasn't required. Larry didn't tell me. By individual morality, I mean the moral standards that apply to individuals in their private lives and in their public lives as people who make their own choices. Primarily, this means standards that determine the permissibility, the impermissibility, and blameworthiness of their individual actions. But it can also include conclusions about values, about what's the best way to live, that are commonly called moral. Political philosophy, on the other hand, I will take to be concerned with moral standards for appraising institutions, for example, as just, unjust, legitimate, or illegitimate. On this account of the matter, the conclusions arrived at in both of these subjects are moral judgments in some broad sense. But what sense is this? This is the first question I want to address about the relation between the two subjects. In what sense are the questions they address both moral questions? As many of you have heard me say before, I believe that in general the term moral is widely used without a clear shared understanding of its content. It's true not only in public discourse, but also in academic discussions, such as those that take place in lectures at the center. It's generally agreed all around, I think, that morality is something important, that moral standards are ones that everyone has particularly good reasons of some kind to take seriously as guides to their conduct. But even people who believe that moral standards should be taken seriously are, I think, often quite unclear about why they should do this. What are the reasons that make these standards binding? And many who are certain have different ideas from others about what these reasons are. I myself will take morality, both in individual morality and in the morality of institutions, to refer to the justifiability to the individuals concerned of, respectively, individual actions and social institutions. And I will assume that we have reason to care about morality because we have reason to care about our relations with others, in which justifiability of these kinds plays an important role. Much depends, of course, on the particular form of justification that is taken to be involved. I have my own view about this, which I will certainly rely on unavoidably to a certain extent, but I will try not to rely on it exclusively in what follows. Leaving aside these differences in detail, however, I believe that morality in this sense is not the only thing that commonly goes under that name. And I want to say a few things about why I think this is so. Here I will, I'm afraid, be repeating some things that I've said elsewhere that some of you are familiar with, but it will be important for what I say later to get them out in the open, so please forgive me. So here's a digression on diverse understandings of morality. It seems to me, as I've said, that we commonly use the term moral as if it were marking something of particular importance, but without being very clear what that importance is. One way to identify different understandings of morality, the way I commonly employ, is to focus on the kind of distress that we think it's appropriate to feel when one realizes that one has fallen short of the requirements of morality in some particular sense. This is what I call the remorse test. Occurred to me, maybe remorse is slightly off. Maybe we should call it the distress test. But that sounds like something that would be imposed on a bank, so I'll stick with remorse. Maybe remorse should be imposed on banks too, but I definitely won't go there. Moral wrongs of the kind I've just described are identified by one form of such distress, the feeling of alienation from others that comes with the realization that one has treated them in a way that couldn't be justified to them, or that one is participating with them in an institution that could not be justified in the appropriate way. But failures of this kind aren't the only kind of thing that's commonly called morally wrong. Various kinds of personal fault, such as the failure to work hard or to strive for what's valuable, for example, are often plausibly called moral faults in a broad sense, even when they don't involve failures in what the person owes to others. In War and Peace, Tolstoy describes Levin returning from a day of mowing in the fields with his peasants, as either being or feeling, it's not quite clear which, morally superior to his brother, who has been lazing at home reading. When we read this, it makes sense to us. But what idea of morality is involved in this idea of the moral superiority of Levin over his brother? It might be that Levin feels less alienated from his peasants, or is less alienated from his peasants, perhaps because he has been, at least in a token way, sharing their labor through the day. This would be to invoke morality in the narrow sense I've described, of feeling of connection with others in a way that one could perhaps justify to them as opposed to a kind of distance from them. But when we read the passage, we might instead be thinking just that it is somehow better, apart from Levin's relations with his peasants, somehow just better of him to have been engaged in good, honest physical labor than to be stretched out on the sofa all day with a cigarette and a novel. The latter idea is a matter of what Bernard Williams, in his famous book Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, called ethics, a matter of how best to live, as opposed to what he called morality, which he took to be concerned just with our obligations to others. Until Williams wrote, the two terms, morality and ethics, were, at least in most academic circles in the United States, used more or less interchangeably. The fact that a philosophy course was called ethics or moral philosophy wouldn't indicate any expected difference in what was being taught or discussed. And one thing about what was being taught or discussed is that the content of the course is unlikely to have had anything to do with sex. That is to say, although, in the view of such a course, some forms of conduct involving sex, such as rape, would be morally wrong in the sense the course deals with, this would just be because they were instances of more generic wrongs, such as the use of force, violence, and deception. Sex itself, the number of individuals involved, whether they were men or women, the parts of the body used, and so on, would be of no moral consequence in the sense of moral that would be discussed in this course, whichever name was attached to it. Out in the world, of course, things are quite different. If you read in the newspaper that there's a question about some politician's morals, you know right away that it has to do with sex. And if ethics is mentioned, then it has to do with money. This explains the name of the Safra Center, right? If it were called the Edmund J. Safra Center for Morality, its agenda would be understood to be quite different. Now, I'm not going to suggest that the center should be renamed, but in fact, it seems to me that the popular way of understanding the distinction between ethics and morality has in fact got things importantly backwards. If there is a difference, as Williams suggested, and as I think he's probably right, between questions of obligation and broader questions of value about how to live, let's call them ethics, and if there are moral issues having to do with sex that go beyond the wrongfulness of rape, deception, and so on, as I think there are, then these issues, these, as you might say, moral issues having to do with sex, are matters of ethics rather than matters of morality. That is, they have to do with what's worth valuing and how it's worth valuing it, rather than with what's permitted or forbidden. Now, this may sound like a pedantic terminological housekeeping, right? More of the curricular thing, but I think it's of genuine importance. It sounds melodramatic to say that many lives are spoiled by the widespread confusion on this point, but I think that's in fact the case. But that's a topic for another lecture. I suppose the title of the lecture would be, Morally and Ethically Speaking, Sex is Like Work. I'll leave it as a homework assignment to you. It's not so difficult to take the pieces that I've given you and figure out why that's so. Right. Okay. Now, I've mentioned sex and hard work as two subjects of moral concern in a sense of moral that goes beyond what I call what we owe to others. Another thing that might fit in morality in this broader sense is loyalty to a cause or institution. Such loyalty, which is plausibly called a moral virtue, I think, is not something that's required by principle specifying what one owes to others, or at least it need not be. Rather, it's a matter of steadfastness in one's commitment to the cause or to the institution that's worth caring about. A person who turns out to be disloyal to our cause or our institution is open to criticism by us who are committed to the cause or institution, not only or simply or primarily for his failure in what he owes to us, his failure is letting us down, but primarily, and in the first instance, open to criticism for having insufficient commitment to it, not caring enough, not really being loyal to the cause. And this is a moral failing only if and only insofar as that cause or institution is itself worthy of this kind of commitment. So we might say loyalty is living up to your commitments to other people. That would be part of morality in this narrow sense. I'm talking about what we owe to each other. But I think we commonly talk about loyalty in this other sense, in which loyalty is the degree of commitment to some cause or institution. Now, my point in this discussion of the diversity of understandings of the term moral is not only that different people seem to use this term with different things in mind, that might have been suggested by my original remark about sex, but also that each of us uses the term, I think, in common discussion to refer to what I think we should see on reflection as a diverse collection of values. When we recognize this diversity, the question we should address, however, is not which of these conceptions of morality gets it right, that is, which one captures what morality really is. Rather, we should ask, what are these values that we're referring to? First, we try to identify what it is that we're thinking when we're drawing a distinction that we call moral. And second, we should ask, well, if I've identified that as the value that's really at stake there, is it really something worth caring about? And why is it worth caring about? We should allow for the possibility that there might be a plurality of different reasons that support the kinds of character, the kinds of commitment, and the kinds of action that we call moral. Now, corresponding to this diversity in ideas of individual morality, there is a diversity in the kind of criticisms of institutions that might be called moral criticisms. As I've said, the institutional morality that I will mainly discuss focuses on the justifiability of institutions to the individuals who participate in and are affected by them, based on their individual claims having to do with how they are affected by that institution. But just as there can be criticism of individuals, plausibly called moral, which is based on their responsiveness to particular values other than their obligations to other people, so also institutions might be criticized on the basis of the kind of individuals they tend to produce, or the kind of lives they encourage these individuals to lead. In A Theory of Justice, Rawls puts forward what I'm here calling an individualist version of the morality of institutions, when he says at the very outset of the book that he is viewing a society as what he calls, quote, a cooperative venture for mutual advantage, designed to advance the good of the individuals with disparate aims and purposes who are taking part in it. A conception of justice, as Rawls understands it, is a set of standards for assessing the claims that such individuals may make against a given form of cooperation, understood in this way. This conception of justice establishes what he refers to as bonds of civic friendship. It gives content to bonds of civic friendship, limiting the individual's pursuit of their disparate aims. This way of understanding justice, and this way of understanding what I'm calling the morality of institutions, differ sharply, for example, from the kind of criticism that would seem appropriate for a society conceived not as a cooperative venture for mutual advantage, but as a collection of citizens united in the pursuit of some distinctive shared goal or value. I've so far been concerned with the question, in what sense of moral are individual morality and the morality of institutions both about morality? My second question about the relation between individual morality and the morality of institutions is how moral conclusions about institutions lead to conclusions about what individuals ought or ought not to do, and whether these conclusions, the conclusions about what individuals ought or ought not to do, exhaust the normative content of conclusions about the morality of institutions. When I started this paper, indeed when I started revising it at the beginning of this week, I was still of the mind that conclusions about what individuals ought or ought not to do in particular actions do not exhaust the normative content of conclusions about the morality of institutions. But I'm now being driven closer to saying that it does, that the morality of institutions comes closer to, as it were, collapsing into individual morality. This rather surprised me, so you can talk me out of it when I get there. So I've so far, okay. The most obvious way in which moral conclusions about institutions, such as conclusions about the justice of particular institutions, can lead to questions about what individuals must do or ought to do is via conclusions about when those individuals ought to obey the law, or more generally, ought to comply with the norms that institutions involve. The second obvious possibility is that conclusions about the morality of institutions can lead to conclusions about what individuals ought to do in the voting booth, or more generally, about what institutions and changes in those institutions individuals should work for. Connections of these two kinds are summed up in what Rawls called the natural duty of justice. In Rawls's words, this duty, quote, requires us to support and to comply with just institutions that exist and apply to us, and also constrains us to further just arrangements not yet established, at least when this can be done without too much cost to ourselves. Now, there's a question about what it is for an institution to apply to someone in the relevant sense. When he says that the duty requires us to support and comply with institutions that exist and apply to us, what does that mean? I take it to mean, number one, that the institution claims to apply to us, and second, that because the institution is just, it really does apply to us. That's the way I'm going to understand that phrase. Much will turn out to depend on that seemingly technical point. Now, focusing for the moment on the first component of this duty, the morality of institutions, if the morality of institutions consisted simply of principles specifying the conditions that institutions have to meet in order to be ones that individuals have a duty to comply with, what might be called principles of legitimacy, then, as I said, the morality of institutions would be a subfield of individual morality. But this seems not to be the case. Few, if any, of the institutions we are familiar with are in fact just. But it doesn't seem to follow that we have no obligation to comply with their requirements. So it would seem that justice aims higher than mere legitimacy in this sense, and sets standards that existing institutions rarely, if ever, meet. This raises the question, what is this higher standard, and what is its practical relevance to us? One answer would be that the higher standard is the standard that institutions need to meet in order for it not to be appropriate for us to feel distress of the kind I described above when we consider the way those institutions treat other people who must comply with them in order for the institutions to function and in particular to meet our own needs. In Rawls's words mentioned above, institutions that aren't fully just strain the bonds of civic friendship. This seems right to me. And distress of this kind is an all too familiar feature of moral and institutional life. But what is the practical significance of this distress? One answer is given by the second component of Rawls's natural duty of justice. Taking standards of justice seriously means taking them as action guiding in the voting booth and on other occasions on which one can have an effect on institutional arrangements. The sad fact, however, is that we generally find ourselves living under and depending on institutions that do not meet standards of justice in ways that we ourselves can't do much, if anything, about. We're trapped via the institutions within which we live in a morally unacceptable relationship with others who are involved in or affected by those institutions. It's worth pausing to stress the essential role of institutions in this kind of distress. If I hear that someone somewhere else is abusing another person, I may feel outrage, but it doesn't involve me. On the other hand, if I learn that an institution on which I rely, even if I had no role in creating it and couldn't change it if I wanted to, if I learn that that institution operates by exploiting people somewhere else, this does involve me and occasions the kind of distress that I'm considering. The institution builds a moral link between me and other people whom I never see. Similar distress may also arise at the level of individual morality. Utilitarianism is often criticized as unacceptably demanding. But taking into account the plight of all the people in the world in desperate need, whom we could help, it seems likely that any plausible account of individual morality will involve standards of individual conduct that we are not meeting, and that we are not likely to meet given our concerns for ourselves and those close to us. If so, then both individual morality and the morality of institutions have their painful side. But these may not be separate problems. The requirements of individual morality that we are most likely to fall short of in this way, such as duties to help the distant or not so distant needy, are problems that really require institutional solutions. So the pain of realizing that one is falling short in these ways is likely to be also a case of the first kind of distress that I mentioned, of participating in institutions or experiencing the lack of institutions that would be required to meet the standards of justice. The examples I just referred to involve our relation to poorer people in other parts of the world, but the points I've made apply domestically as well. We rely on the poor people in the US who pick our fruit just as much as on the poor elsewhere who pick our coffee, so the same problems arise. Some might say that insofar as imperfection of this kind is something we have no way to avoid, distress about it is idle utopian hand-wringing. Against this, it seems to me that to dismiss it would be heartless. It's natural to read the moving final paragraph of Rawls' A Theory of Justice as expressing a longing for a condition in which such distress could in good conscience be avoided. However eloquent one finds that passage, however, one may still wonder whether justice, in the ideal sense with which Rawls is concerned in that book, has anything to tell us about how to think about what to do in the conditions under which we actually live. To consider this question, I want to look more closely at the difference between individual morality and the morality of institutions, and consider the moral difference that institutions may make. I will start then with the idea of principles governing individual action that are justifiable to all, as I say, principles that no one could reasonably reject, but leaving more open than I do in other work exactly what kinds of objections might be relevant. The general principles that I suggest we must think about when deciding whether it would be morally permissible to act in a certain way may already seem like a practice or an institution. When I ask whether anybody could object to a certain principle, I'm imagining what would it be like to live under this requirement and generally comply with it. This is particularly so given that in deciding whether such a principle is justifiable, we must take into account consequences other than the effects of individual actions. We have to take into account what it would be like to live against a background in which people were behaving in general in a certain way. But I'm going to take it as a mark of the first stage of the morality of actions that I'm now talking about, that the principles we're concerned with are not themselves conditional on their being generally complied with. So, for example, the prohibition against the use of deadly force has exceptions. We are permitted to use deadly force when we are attacked, and using it is necessary to preserve our lives. But this restriction, with this exception, applies to us whether or not that principle itself is being generally observed. It would still be wrong for us to attack someone who presented no threat to us, even if many or even if most people were not in fact observing this constraint. So that principle is a principle of individual conduct which doesn't depend on the existence of a practice or institution, so I claim. In other cases, however, what it's permissible for us to do depends on what principles most others are, as a matter of fact, actually following. Suppose, for example, that the general use of products containing a certain chemical poses a serious threat to the health of all of us, and that there's no ambiguity about the appropriate remedy, which is just to stop using the products. If, recognizing this fact, most people have adopted a policy of not using these chemicals, then I believe it would be wrong for me to go on using them myself. A principle permitting people to exempt themselves from this established practice is one that could reasonably be rejected in my terms. If, however, a great majority of people, maybe almost everybody, continues to use these products despite the known effects, is it still wrong for me to use them? If giving up the products involves at least some cost, and any single individual's use of the products doesn't make a significant difference to the health hazard, then there may seem to be a paradox. On the one hand, it may seem pointless for one individual to give up the products for no significant benefit. On the other hand, their general use violates a principle that no one could reasonably reject and is causing serious harms. It seems somehow clearly incorrect to say that no one is doing anything wrong by continuing to use them. So is the principle forbidding such use conditional on its being generally complied with or not? Call this the non-compliance dilemma. This is less of a dilemma than it appears because the appearance of a dilemma rests on considering only two alternatives, compliance or non-compliance. One answer might be that when there is general non-compliance, non-rejectable principles would require us to take various steps to make known to others our willingness to go along with a principle forbidding the use of the products, to urge upon them the importance of doing likewise. This may involve abstaining from the use of the products ourselves to provide an example to others and a sign of good faith. But if a person has done this repeatedly over a period of time and general non-compliance persists, then I think it might not be wrong for the person not to comply if complying has significant personal cost. This appears to be a moral parallel to Rawls' natural duty of justice. If a practice exists and is just, then it's wrong not to comply with it. If a practice is needed but doesn't exist, one is required to take reasonable steps toward trying to get such a practice established. I say that this is a parallel to Rawls's natural duty rather than an instance of it, because the idea of a just practice that it invokes is not the same as the one that Rawls has in mind. When I said that the practice in my example was just, what I meant was that there's no objection to it based on the way it assigns benefits and burdens. The standard that I have in mind, or you have in mind for assessing this, deciding whether there's any objection to the way it distributes benefits and burdens, need not be Rawls's two principles of justice. This looseness in the idea of what a just institution or practice would be will again turn out to have important implications and consequences in what I'm going to say later on. The example I chose had a number of simplifying features. The harm that justified the institution, I supposed, was the cumulative effect of the actions of many individuals. And that effect was preventable simply by those individuals each ceasing to produce their bit of this harm. There was therefore a single obvious solution to the problem, namely that individuals should simply stop using the products in question. This illustrates one way in which institutions can be important, by coordinating the actions of many people to produce large effects that they could not produce by individual action. A second important feature of many institutions, however, is not present in this case. This is that institutions can create new normative powers and have effects on what we do that are magnified by those powers. Property is an example. In the absence of any institution, I can, by consenting to your taking an object, my pen or something, make it the case that you do not wrong me by taking it and running off with it. That is, you aren't wronging me. But I can't in the absence of an institution, I can't, by giving it to you, make it the case that other people would wrong you if they took it from you. That is, I can't myself make it yours, although I can make it the case that you don't wrong me by using it. My having the power to make it yours takes an institution of property, which defines conditions of ownership, transfer, and so on. An institution of property gives these powers and relations institutional definitions, and if that institution is just, these powers become moral powers and relations as well. That is, they create obligations on other people not to take your pen, as it might be. By existing and being just, such an institution changes what individuals can permissibly do, not simply by making some acts permissible that were previously impermissible, but by enlarging the sphere of possible actions. In the example I just considered, the harm in question was the cumulative effect of the actions of many individuals, and it was preventable simply by those individuals each ceasing to produce their bit of the harm. There was therefore, as I said, a single obvious solution to the problem, namely that individuals should simply stop using the products in question. But now consider a case in which several different practices would constitute morally acceptable solutions to a problem. The moral acceptability of each of these institutions is a matter that any individual can determine just by thinking about it. I consider what the institution is like. I think what would it be like to live under that? Would anybody have a reasonable objection to the way in which it passes out the benefits and burdens, to the ways in which it would constrain people's liberty and so on? And just by thinking about it, I can decide if the answer is yes, that institution is okay, or the answer is no, and that it's not. But when there are several morally acceptable institutions, it may seem that all the affected individuals are entitled to a role in choosing which of these institutions is the one that's going to be realized. And this might be taken to mark a difference between moral philosophy and the morality of institutions, in the realistic case where multiple institutions are possible. That is, conclusions about the morality of institutions may seem to depend on actual collective deliberation, as opposed to merely hypothetical reasoning of the kind through which an individual can arrive at conclusions about the rightness or wrongness of particular actions. This is a plausible and appealing idea, but I think on reflection, it's not one we should accept. It may seem that a form of consent or choice was already involved in the very idea of the existence of an institution. A practice exists, in the sense I'm talking about, only if most people in the relevant territory, in fact, follow it. This was present even in my first example of how the existence of a practice to prevent a public bad, a certain kind of threat to health, affected what it was permissible for individuals to do. But this form of consent is limited. Many people will simply find themselves in a situation where a practice exists in this sense. This fact, the existence of the practice, changes their moral situation, whether or not the practice is one that they would have chosen. This is especially obvious when we consider the extension of practices over time. Most of the practices that affect our lives, certainly the most important political institutions, are ones that, if they were chosen by anyone, were chosen by others long ago. This fact, that most of us are bound to generally be institution takers rather than institution makers, seems to be not itself a problem. Even when there are multiple morally acceptable institutions that would solve a given problem, if one of these just institutions is in place and generally complied with, then we are obligated to comply with it. We should be so lucky. The fact that we didn't choose this particular just institution is unimportant. We should distinguish here, however, between what might be called external and internal choice. Internal choice is a matter of the powers that institutions give to their citizens to revise those institutions or change their relation to them. External choice would be the choice of those institutions. The idea I've just been questioning is that the legitimacy of an institution where there are multiple equally just possibilities depends upon external choice. This idea faces the difficulty that effective collective choice of an institution requires another higher order practice through which that choice is made effective. This practice, ratification or whatever, could itself take several different morally acceptable forms. So there would be a question of how a particular institution, that is a particular mechanism of ratification, could itself be legitimated. This problem is discussed very interestingly in Dennis Thompson's article, Who Should Govern Who Governs, which is about the choice of a new constitution in British Columbia. It seems to me inescapable that at some level then, the fact that an institution is morally acceptable and being generally complied with is sufficient. Its being chosen is beside the point. This is the problem of institutional regress. Now, internal choice is another matter. The powers that an institution gives to its members to revise its requirements by voting, by participating in various mechanisms of change, is a fundamental question of justice, on which the moral acceptability of those institutions themselves heavily depends. The same is true, I think, of opportunities that institutions give to members to opt out of those institutions altogether. Perhaps some collective institutions are permissible or morally justifiable or not open to objection only if they allow people to opt out of them if they wish. This point tracks in a slightly more concrete form the point I made earlier about what it is for an institution to apply to someone. It might be said that an institution applies to someone only if he or she has chosen to be subject to it. The answer, however, is that there is no such external criterion of application. There are, however, important internal criteria governing the range of people that an institution can claim to apply to and still be just. Focusing on this fact brings out an important question, which I hadn't seen clearly enough before, about the division of labor, so to speak, between the idea of a just institution and what Rawls called the natural duty to comply with an institution if it exists and is just. If we think of the relevant notion of justice that's invoked here, we say if the institution is just and it's in place, then you have a duty to comply. If we think of the relevant notion of justice that that is invoked there in purely distributive terms as a matter of the way in which certain material benefits and burdens are assigned, say, equally or unequally, then the natural duty of justice, or the parallel version of it that I've been considering, makes a very strong moral claim. It derives a moral conclusion about individual conduct from this, as it were, structural feature of an institution. As long as the goodies are handed out evenly, then if it exists and it's being complied with, then you've got to go along with it. That's a powerful, that's a very substantive claim. I'm not saying that it's false, but it's a substantive claim. But, as I've just said a minute ago, it seems that there might be something objectionable about an institution that claims to apply to people whom it has no legitimate need to control in order to provide the good that justifies it. Or it might be reasonable to object to an institution that fails to give people the opportunity to opt out if they should wish to do so. Whether this is objectionable or not depends, I would say, on, number one, the importance of the good that the institution provides, and second, the need that the institution has to be able to apply to these people, that is, to govern what they do, in order to provide that good. This question about the justice of the institution goes beyond the question simply of how benefits and burdens are distributed. It also includes how certain rights and powers are distributed and how extensive the claims are that it makes about whom it applies to. Those may be included, perhaps, say, in Rawls's first principle of basic liberties, but they aren't obvious on the list, and they aren't the ones that mainly come to mind if you think of justice, for example, mainly in terms of Rawls's second principle, the difference principle. So, if these conditions that I've just mentioned, that is, if the defensibility of an institution's claim to apply to certain people, are considered among the criteria of justice, then, from the fact that an institution is just in this capacious sense, it will simply follow directly that if it exists, that is generally complied with, then those to whom it claims to apply are morally bound to accept its requirements. It's a rather short step, because it's already been built in to the idea that the claims that they make to apply to people are justified by the need to control those people in the relevant ways in order to provide the sufficiently important good, and that the way it's controlling them is distributively fair, and so on. So all of the work is done already in the premise that the institution is just. There isn't much work left for the so-called natural duty of justice to do, at least as far as the first clause of it is concerned, which requires one to comply with an institution that's just and actually applies to you. Now, I've just been discussing the possibility of multiple institutions that are equally just. As I said, we should be so lucky. What I'm concerned with now, however, is the case of unjust institutions. Suppose that some practice exists, that is to say, it's generally complied with, provides some important good or goods to all of us, or most of us at least, but is unjust. Suppose it provides a good that nearly everyone uses and relies on in their daily lives, but does so in a way that imposes an unfair burden on one subgroup of the population. From the point of view of those who benefit, recognizing that this is so should occasion the kind of remorse or distress that I described above. Taking seriously the second clause of the natural duty of justice, they have a duty to try to improve the institution insofar as they can do this. But insofar as they can't, they will properly feel trapped in the way I said, trapped in a relation of institutional connection that they don't want, they recognize as indefensible, but can't avoid. A relation, that is, with those whom the practice treats unjustly. But now let's shift our perspective. Looking at the matter rather from the point of view of those who are treated unjustly, we can ask, do they have an obligation to do their part as the scheme dictates? And it seems to me that they may not. Now, of course, there's a matter of degree here. How unjust does the scheme have to be in order to undermine their obligation? No institution is perfect, after all. We can't insist on perfection. And the answer may also depend on how important the good is that the scheme provides. But I think it's not implausible at all to say that under a range of plausible ways of answering these questions of degree, it's permissible for those who would be treated unfairly simply to refuse to comply on the terms offered. If so, then we have arrived at another instance of the moral parallel to Rawls' natural duty of justice that I referred to above, but now in a strengthened version. I stated this principle above as a sufficient condition for people having an obligation to comply. So if institutions are just and apply to you, then you have a duty to comply. But if what I've just said is right, then there are a wide range of cases in which it's also a necessary condition. If the institution is not just, then, and you're being treated unjustly, then that it may follow, modulo these issues of degree, that you aren't obligated to comply. Now these issues of degree are not nothing, but I think they're a much smaller matter than I suggested earlier in this lecture, when I said confidently that justice was clearly a much higher standard than mere legitimacy, understood as the property of being an institution that those to whom it applies are obligated to comply with. If in the present case this gap between justice and legitimacy seems to have been closed, or at least to have been greatly narrowed, why is this so? What has changed in my mind between my confident assertion that justice is a higher standard and now my conclusion, well, if it's clearly unjust, then, modulo these differences of degree, people aren't obligated to comply with it if they're being treated unjustly. This difference, the shift from the way things seemed to me when I wrote that first sentence and the way it seems to me here at the end, is due, I think, primarily to two things. The first, is that in presenting the example I'm now talking about, I imagined a single narrowly specified institution that provided some particular good. And I asked, how did it provide the good? What was the need for the good? How did it distribute the good? And so on, right? And I considered this specific institution in isolation from other factors. In particular, I was considering it, or asking you to consider it, in isolation from any broader institutional background, such as legislative history or some other larger political process through which it might have been enacted. I tried to focus your attention in this last part of my discussion simply on the benefit that this particular practice provides and on the way that it does this, on the demands that it makes and the way it distributes the benefits. Second, in asking whether those who are treated unjustly by this practice nonetheless are obligated to do their part in it, I have focused on one source of such obligation and one source only. Namely, I've asked what's called by what I called earlier. Now I just realized that this earlier bit got dropped out in order to make the lecture fit into the time, but I'm going to ad-lib it back. The horizontal relation between fellow citizens. Okay, I'm going to digress here to take you back to this piece that I left out because it has to do with our host here. Corruption occurs, Larry tells us, when the internal economy of an institution is such as to lead its decisions to be made in a way that undermines the trust that others can place in it. Larry puts this in his statement. I had this quote. I don't know how this got, this is a danger of word processing, right? Had a quote from the statement of the lab's state purpose. He says, corruption occurs when it leads these decisions to be made in a way that in fact undermines public trust. I don't want to go that way. I want to say that corruption occurs when the internal economy, which leads people to make decisions within an institution in such a way, should undermine the trust that other people have in it. So I trust an airline. When I go on an airline, I trust it to be organized in such a way that the mechanics tighten the bolts on the engines when they put them back together. Not that simply those individuals do it, but there's a regime of supervisors, checklists, and so on, so that the overall workings of the institution is guided by the goal of passenger safety. Right? I trust Harvard be organized in such a way that it tends to promote the good of scholarship and high quality teaching, that is, to be organized in such a way with assignment of institutional roles and the creation of an institutional culture so that I can count on it to act as an institution in ways that are responsive to these values. I trust it. That trust is a judgment about its relation to those values. I'm loyal. I might be loyal to it in the Harvard case because I think it's worth supporting, it's worth sacrificing to do my part, and because it actually operates. Its internal economy of influence, as Larry calls it, is such as to cause it to operate in a way that's guided by these values. That kind of trust and that kind of loyalty sound moral, right? Trust and loyalty, they're moral ideas. But in that case, I think their force derives from the value of the good that the institution is supposed to be providing. It's because one cares about my safety, because I care about my safety, that I care whether American Airlines is trustworthy in this particular way. It's because I think that the goals that Harvard purports to be pursuing and invites us to support it, and so on, because it is pursuing. It's because of those values that I am inclined to be loyal to it. If I decide to withdraw my trust and loyalty from an institution in this way, I'm withdrawing it because I realize that it's not actually doing what I thought. It's not actually responsive to the value I thought it was responsive to. This is like the case I mentioned earlier of individuals. If we're members of a cause or something, and we find that one of our members actually isn't really committed, he doesn't actually care that much about it, we regard him as disloyal. It's not simply that he's defaulting on what he owes to us. He's failing in his attachment to being to the goal. So in this case, we could say the institution is fit. So in this case, I want to call the pull of loyalty a vertical pull. The pull of loyalty in these institutional cases and the importance of trust is, you might say, a vertical moral relationship, as opposed to my thinking, this guy's been letting us down by not doing his part in the institution. That's a horizontal. Look, we're all cooperating members of some enterprise, and he's not doing his share. That's a horizontal, what I'm calling here a horizontal link. Pardon me for, I don't know how, my attempt to get under the word limit caused this to get left out. So, in asking whether those who are treated unjustly by a social practice, right, are obligated to do their part in it, I'm focusing in what I presented to you on one source of such an obligation. That is, what's required by horizontal loyalty, or what we owe to each other as cooperating members, what Rawls called the bonds of civic friendship. If we ask of these people who are treated unjustly in the institution I'm imagining, do they owe it to their fellow citizens so to comply? Would they be violating what they owe to us, letting it down? If the institution is significantly unjust, I think the answer to that question might well be no. They don't owe it to us, given the institutional relation that holds between us. Now, when I said earlier that the justice of an institution couldn't be a condition of obligation to comply with it, because justice is a higher standard, we have all these unjust institutions, but people aren't actually, are still obligated to comply with them in my earlier mode, things were different. I was referring not to a single sort of particular form of cooperation to produce a particular good. I was referring to a very complicated, large-scale political institution that has within it all kinds of subparts, including the FDA and all kinds of different things. Right? And I said none of these large-scale things is fully just, yet we surely do not want to say that no one has an obligation to comply with their laws. Now, one might say that the difference between this case and my imaginary example in the latter part of my talk is just the matter of degree that I mentioned. But I don't think that's the main difference. The real-world institutions that we were thinking of when I said earlier that justice is a higher standard than legitimacy, and we are obligated to comply with the law, even in institutions that are unjust, the real-world institutions that I was referring to there, including our own dear basic structure, involve quite severe levels of injustice. So I don't think it's just a matter of degree. Yet we don't think that there's no obligation to obey their requirements, or at least that was what I thought when I wrote that sentence, and I invited you to go along with me. Now, this is an instance of what we do in philosophy. I always say to my students that thinking about philosophy is like watching a stage magician and trying to figure out where the trick is performed, except that in this case, you're both the magician and the person who's trying to detect the trick. So here, I found myself having performed this trick on myself. That is, I thought, no, yes, obviously, justice is a higher standard than mere legitimacy. And then I thought about this other example, and I thought, well, no, it's not so obvious. Maybe unjust institutions, in these cases, there really isn't. So where was the trick? So the point is to go back, look at what was happening. So what I've just been saying, well, look, in the first case, we were thinking of a very big, complicated institution with many parts. Here we're thinking about only an isolated one. In my isolated case, we were focusing simply on this one idea of where an obligation might come from, namely this horizontal relation of cooperation and what we owe to other people just because we're cooperating with them. Whereas on when we were thinking of unjust institutions in the real world, we didn't probably have a very clear idea about what form of obligation we were talking about. We were just thinking, oh, everybody not obeying the law, that would be very bad. We don't think that. We don't think that, right? But when we think of the obligation to obey the law, many different laws might come to mind, including laws against attacking people on the street, laws against stealing from them whenever we can, and so on. The idea that people have no obligation not to do these things seems clearly wrong, even if the overall institutions are unjust. But the wrongfulness of these actions doesn't really depend upon their being forbidden by institutions. They are wrong simply according to the requirements of individual morality that prevent us from harming other people in these ways. The question is whether other things are wrong simply because they're ruled out by these requirements. More particularly, the question is whether we owe it to our fellow citizens as a matter, so to speak, of horizontal reciprocity, not to do whatever our shared institutions, require of us. This is the second difference between the example I just discussed and the more general question of legitimacy I mentioned earlier. In discussing that example, as I said, I focused on one particular source of obligation to comply, whereas in my earlier remark, I left the nature of this obligation unspecified. To focus the mind a bit, consider the point of view of a worst off group in our society, people who are born and live in urban black ghettos. Here I draw on Tommy Shelby's discussion in his excellent paper in Philosophy and Public Affairs on justice, deviance, and the dark ghetto, but he's not responsible for what I say. These people grow up in conditions that present them with very limited opportunities for economic advancement and with limited educational opportunities, which make it unlikely that they will overcome these hurdles. I think that institutions that avoidably put people in such conditions are unjust in the general but incompletely specified sense of just that I've been relying on. It would, however, still be wrong for people in those circumstances to do things that cause pain, injury, and death to other individuals. Many instances of theft would also be wrong for the same reason. It would be wrong for them to steal people's food or their means of livelihood, such as the car they need to get to work. But many laws don't forbid things simply of this kind. I have in mind laws such as zoning regulations, drug laws, laws against prostitution, and some forms of financial regulation, for example. I think it's not implausible to say that victims of extreme injustice of the kind that we can see not far away could be justified in violating some laws of the latter kind by selling drugs, for example, or defaulting on their credit cards if they're charged exceptionally high rates of interest, when doing this is the best way they have to get by and support themselves and their families. I don't think that in violating such laws, they would be violating duties of reciprocity owed to the rest of us. Going beyond obedience to law and the justifiability of enforcement, however, there's another range of obligations that can be affected by injustice, which is the obligations of those treated unjustly to be willing to work on the terms made available to them. If they don't owe it to us to be willing to cooperate on these terms, then it would be unjust to withhold other forms of public benefit, such as public assistance or medical care, or other benefits from those among the poor on the ground that they're refusing to do their share. Returning now to our own perspective rather than that of the disadvantaged, this puts a slightly different light on the feeling of being trapped in institutions that treat others unjustly. This feeling arose from the observation that it is beyond our power to do much to make our institutions fully just. This seems true, but if what I've said is correct, then standards of justice have implications for things that we can do. For example, for the position we should take on welfare policy, drug laws, and general issues of law enforcement and incarceration. These might at first seem to be matters of social policy rather than fundamental justice, but justice has something to say about them. The differences I noted between real-world institutions and the isolated practice in my example call attention to a general feature of Rawls's approach, which I should mention. First, by taking the basic institutions of a society as the unique subject of justice, Rawls focuses on a practice that will in reality involve many layers of law and policy. Second, he focuses on one particular source of obligation, as I've said. He asks, what would this complex practice as a whole have to be like in order for us to owe it to our fellow citizens, as I've put it, as a matter of reciprocity, to comply with all of its requirements? The first of these features, the focus on the justice of a basic structure, a constitution together with laws of property and associated fundamental features of an economy and a political system. The focus on the justice of a basic structure so conceived, rather than on the justice of particular laws or policies taken in isolation, is a fundamental feature of Rawls's approach. I've always myself been a big supporter of this idea and defended it in many writings. But in writing this paper, and in focusing on the problem of unjust institutions rather than just ones, I found myself deviating from the true path. It seemed to me that in order to sort out the implications of injustice for the rights and wrongs of individual action, I need to consider the defensibility of particular laws and policies looked at more in isolation. I've just discovered this fact about myself, and I'm not yet sure what to make of this deviation. Maybe it's just a mistake on my part, and some loyal Rawlsians in the audience will beat me back into the fold. Or perhaps the focus on the basic structure as the exclusive subject of justice makes more sense when one is thinking of what Rawls calls a well-ordered society, in which a just basic structure confers legitimacy downward on all the subparts of the system, but is less applicable when the question is how to deal with institutions that are less than fully just, and maybe not even close. Maybe the basic structure as subject is good for ideal justice, but not so good for thinking about what should we do now. Second feature of Rawls' approach, the focus on a particular kind of obligation, may also sound rather ideal. When I tried to get you to feel the force of the idea that people who are treated very unjustly, as I would see, deprived of certain opportunities, their opportunities are very limited, might not have an obligation to comply with just every law that the institutions enact. I tried to make that seem real by saying, well, my question there is, do they owe it to the rest of us, given the terms we are offering them, to cooperate with us on those terms? Maybe focusing on this particular source of obligation, this idea of the obligation of reciprocity, whatever, maybe that's too ideal. So maybe we should say, look, people have other reasons for obeying the law. I mean, I distinguish between the reasons for obeying the law because disobeying the law is causing harm to their neighbors and their fellow citizens, other people around them. That's one kind of reason. But aside from that, I said the only alternative is this very abstract idea of what we owe to each other as cooperating members of a practice, either a very large, complicated practice, or maybe if we focus on one particular version of it. So maybe there's another alternative. Maybe you can tell me. Maybe there are other reasons why people ought to obey the law. But if not, it seems to me that focusing on this particular source of obligation provides maybe a helpful guide to distinguishing in cases of injustice, even though it may seem a very ideal notion, if it is the real alternative to justifying the law simply on the basis of the harms it prevents, then focusing on that source of obligation may be a useful guide for distinguishing between what we can ask of people in unjust situations and what we cannot. Finally, let me return in closing to the question of corruption. I said earlier, or not as much earlier as I'd intended, that loyalty to institutions of a certain kind, of which I gave Harvard as an example, derives its normative force in the first instance vertically from the value that we take those institutions to be responsive to, and only secondarily or derivatively from our horizontal sense of what we owe to our fellow participants in order not to let them down. If we turn our attention to political institutions, however, things are, or so it seems to me, different. When political institutions are seen in the Rawlsian way as systems of cooperation, the loyalty we owe to them is, even in the first instance, fundamentally a horizontal obligation to our fellow citizens as fellow cooperating members, an obligation to comply with the fair terms of cooperation with them. The value that the institutions are serving isn't some higher value, it is rather facilitating the right kind of relation between us. There's no vertical dimension. So if that's the way we should understand loyalty and trust, that's the way we should understand loyalty and obligation, what do we want to say about trust? The corresponding trust in the case of political institutions, as opposed to airlines and universities, is that we trust the institutions to operate in a way that's responsive to horizontal equity, responsive to maintaining the kind of relations between us that morally we are entitled to and want to have. That is to say, we trust our political institutions, we trust the legislative process and the judicial system. The relevant form of trust is to trust them to operate in a way that is, at least at the limits, responsive to the requirements of justice. Now, whether any given set of institutions actually operates in a way that justifies this trust depends on what Larry calls the internal economy of influence, governing those who play crucial roles within that institution. The relevant form of corruption occurs when this motivational economy is out of whack, and participants in the institution are moved to behave in ways that make the withdrawal of this trust appropriate, make it appropriate to withdraw our confidence that they, in the judicial system or the legislature, whatever it is, will overall be responsive to the demands of treating us and our fellow citizens justly. The response, corresponding to the work of Larry's lab, would be to consider how institutional rules and incentives might be changed to avoid or minimize this corruption, to try to rejigger the internal economy of influence to make the institution more trustworthy. Dennis Thompson's excellent book, Ethics in Congress, is one example of this enterprise, and there are others out there. But it would, I think, be a mistake to focus our attention here on elected officials as the main, or at least the only, loci, whatever, of political corruption in the sense I'm talking about. The role of citizen is also an office. In A Theory of Justice, Rawls says that the function of a shared sense of justice among citizens in a well-ordered society is to move and guide citizens not only to comply with just institutions, but to change those institutions in a way that's necessary to keep them just. He said a well-ordered society would be in equilibrium. It would be in a just state, held in equilibrium by the fact, among other things, that the citizens, moved by their sense of justice, would, in their internal economy of influence, operate in such a way as to work through the political process to move the institution back in the direction of justice when circumstances change and it falls away from that path. So it would seem to follow that it's a case of corruption in Larry's sense when the economy of influence among citizens in a democracy is such that citizens are not moved to play this crucial equilibrating role. This is a problem that can't, I think, be solved only by tweaking the institutional structures within which this economy operates. It requires some more fundamental change in the outlook of our citizens. The problem lies deeper in our shared sense of justice or the lack thereof. And on that less than happy note, I will end.
Like the way they have it set up, they have mics on both sides, so maybe we should have people come up to both sides and then we can alternate.
Yeah.
So we have mics. Why don't we just keep? Are you going to pass the mics around? Okay. So then we're not going to do what I just said. So I will control a queue to ask questions, and please signal, and I will get the mic to you while the other question is being asked. First one right here, David.
So, Tim, is this on? Yeah. Tim, first of all, nobody who's affiliated with the center at this event can't start by just saying thank you for all the years. I was a fellow in 1989, and you have shaped my life in all the years since, and I really appreciate everything you've done here. This was a brilliant talk, extremely complex in its details, so I'm not sure I'll get this question at the right level. But one thing I heard you say towards the beginning was the question of whether there was any difference between political philosophy or political morality and ordinary morality of individuals, and that you were being driven to say the answer was no, despite what you thought initially you would say. And in the example that you gave about when people don't have to comply with unjust institutions, the issue you didn't talk about was one of what's their obligation when not complying. That is, things like conscientious objection. Should they have to do it openly? Since we're invoking Tommy Shelby, who I'm sitting next to, what's the implication of Martin Luther King's understanding of that in Letter from a Birmingham Jail and other things about the open, loving disagreement of the law, particularly in a situation which was clearly unjust towards those people who were affected by it. And if there is something like that, that is that there's an obligation to do it openly and maybe even to accept the penalties, that's obviously the most extreme form of that argument, isn't that giving some weight to the political institutions themselves? And whether or not that's an instance of that only applies if you think you're operating in some generally just world, even though there's particular aspects that are unjust, so that's the Rawls general particular aspect, or whether it's just some idea that there's a weight to the political institutions that's beyond just what the individualized effects that you said. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Right. Okay, good. So I ad-libbed an overstatement, no doubt. That is, I want to mark the fundamental difference between the sub-part, the central part of individual morality and what I call the morality of institutions, just as the second has to do with constraints on individuals that arise from the existence of certain practices. Whereas there's a part of individual morality that doesn't depend on that, there's a part that does. That's a big distinction. Then I said, there are standards that apply to these institutions, that is, whether they're just or not. And what's the content of that? Is the significance of the question, are these institutions just or not, exhausted by the implications that has for what individuals should do? And I at first thought, when I started writing, that the answer to that question was, no, it's not, that there's a higher standard and so on. And then later I decided, well, it's much closer to that. Okay, now you're correctly saying maybe even that is an overstatement. Well, the question of why I was talking about people having good enough reason to disobey the law because they needed to disobey it in order to get by. And I wanted to say that could be a sufficient reason to do it under those circumstances. Now, the question of civil disobedience is a different question. It's about how effectively to carry out a campaign to try to make institutions more just, and what's the best and most defensible way of doing that. And it may involve accepting the punishment and so on. All the Gandhian reasons for doing that don't necessarily flow from an obligation to do that, but rather that's part of what you're doing to try to bring on yourself in a visible and dramatic way the consequences of the injustice of the institution, and cause people to see this and ask our fellow citizens, do you really mean to do this to me? Do you really stand by the idea that this is our relation? So I think that at least a large part of the justification for accepting the penalty and so on in civil disobedience is a matter of the appropriate kind of political strategy rather than necessarily a residual obligation. But it also, I might be wrong, maybe there's more of the latter, but that's my first reply.
Oh, Professor Scanlon. During your talk, you mentioned that you were worried that you were deviating from Rawls's path because Rawls applies the two principles of justice to the basic structure, but you were, instead of raising questions about the basic structure, raising questions about the justice of individual laws. But I wanted to suggest that perhaps your difference with Rawls might be exaggerated in that he can actually take into account the justice of basic laws in two ways. First, he does talk about civil disobedience and conscientious refusal towards the end of part 2 of A Theory of Justice, and that deals with the justice of individual laws and policies. And secondly of all, Rawls can also take into account the justice of individual laws through his four-stage sequence, because in the legislative stage as well as the judicial stage, the third and fourth stage of his four-stage sequence. So the good news is that you might not have actually deviated that much from Rawls.
I'm waiting for the bad news. That's very helpful. I'm glad. All I have to say is thank you. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the people who are faring more well off, or are more advantaged than they should be. They're also being treated unjustly in a way, but not to their disadvantage, to their advantage. It seems to me that, first of all, when Rawls says you have a duty to change institutions towards a more just, if it's not too much burden on you. So I want to know whether you think it's a great burden on people to give up the ill-gotten gains that they have as a consequence of the unjust regime. So they're doing very well off. They're doing very well. And if they were to give up 40% of their income, they still would not be as badly off as they, in a sense, should be if there were a just regime. Now, it's difficult to calculate these things. Where would I be? So I'm just wondering, when does it become too difficult for these people, perhaps all of us, not saying these people, not to include us, to give things up? And the related question is, if you're going to allow those who are disadvantaged unjustly to break certain laws, will you allow those who are advantaged unjustly to break certain laws in order to help those who are disadvantaged unjustly? So suppose that the ghetto individual cannot get away with breaking the prostitution law or the drug law, but you, perhaps someone who hasn't sworn allegiance to the law, perhaps, have the ability to make it the case that he gets off or she gets off. I'm not clear how the duties or the permissions, that apply to the unjustly disadvantaged do not also give permission to the unjustly advantaged. So that's a two-part question.
Francis, you're uncharacteristically making us sound more consequentialist than I intended to be. That is, I was drawing a distinction between the force of a law being undermined by the fact that the practice that it involved was unjustifiable, as opposed to our justifying a law which is perfectly justifiable on the ground that by breaking it we can change this other, we can remedy this other injustice. I was supposing that, say, that the particular, say, procedural, I was imagining the case like this, maybe this wasn't what you had in mind, that the procedural and evidential requirements of a trial are are just, right? We might say, look, the procedural rules of our criminal procedure are just, we might say, but this person who violated an unjust, substantively unjust actual law is being charged, but by putting in some stuff that's evidence that isn't evidence, or by violating a procedural norm, I could get him off. That was what came to mind from your example.
Oh, I'm sorry. Then maybe what I had in mind was you see an instance of the drug, purchasing or selling, or the prostitution, and you don't report it when you otherwise should, if you thought. So in other words, you're not. Okay.
In that case, I don't take the obligation to report quite that straight, but in that case, I would say yes, you're right. I would agree with that. The first part, can you just? The
first part
was
about
whistle just a chord or something.
How difficult is it to bring about the just institution? Rawls says that it's not too much. And the question is, you have to give up a lot of money, but it's all ill-gotten gains, given that it's the result of the injustice.
But okay, it involves such a complicated set of things. If you're giving up the money in order to fund a political campaign, the question is, do you still have to do it if the money you got is ill-gotten? Is that the idea?
Give it to an educational institution. Whatever you think is the way to bring about a more just distribution or a better institution, it needn't be a political campaign. Right. The question is, is it within the scope of, you don't have to do it if it's too burdensome? Does that apply to the stuff that you have unjustly?
It's a good question. I'm inclined to say that certainly qualifies the burden, yes. Right. To claim that it's a burden to give up something that you aren't entitled to is a bit rich.
And I tend to think that would have a massive effect on behavior if people took that seriously.
Well, I agree. That would be good, no?
So Jenny's next, but let me just intervene with one question that follows on the second of Francis's question. Let's imagine you're a legal system that has a law against, has illegal drugs which they try to regulate. And they see a certain compliance rate, let's say 98%. And then your insight about the possibility of people who are being treated unjustly, ignoring certain laws or having it adjust to, actually produces many more people ignoring that law.
Right.
And the compliance rate falls significantly.
Right.
And I, as the lawmaker, now have to decide whether to adjust the severity of my punishments or the police force to bring the compliance rate back up. Should I take into account the facts that you have made us see about
Absolutely, yes.
And so I should not adjust my
That's right, you should not. Particularly if what you're going to do is produce this huge, contribute to this large mass of more or less serially incarcerated people impoverishing these communities. Yes, absolutely. That would be an example of what I said, is that there's an implication of this rather abstract idea of justice for what might otherwise seem to be rather specific questions of policy, such as what should we do about enforcement. Yeah,
that's very helpful. Okay, Jenny?
I would like to pick up on a throwaway line in which you said that choice was not necessary.
Right.
And I wonder, in making the case for an obligation to comply, does choice have no status separate from justice? I'm thinking that inviting you to think that there might be plural sources of political obligation, and that one might be based in choice. Now, you might just want to sort of assimilate it to justice, but if, as someone raised in political science, I think of one particular set of justifications as being quite important, namely the justifications of the state's monopoly of violence, of coercion, of the capacity to restrict your liberty. And one thing we've often said is that, well, all right, you can restrict my liberty if I consent to having my liberty restricted. My choice is to do that, and then democracy is a form of collectivizing choice. So if you had two polities, and polity A distributed material things in a relatively just way, and distributed self-respect in a relatively just way, and distributed even liberty in the sense of minimum interference and so forth in a relatively just way. But polity B was less just on all those things, but was a democracy. Would that count at all in the equation? And if so, sort of how?
Sure, it would count. But that's a matter of what I call internal choice rather than external choice. I said it's part. I said, look, the idea of justice I'm invoking here is a very vague grab bag that the institutions that are not open to objection about the way serious objection about the way they distribute benefits and burdens and powers and opportunities, right? And I didn't try to specify it, but having the ability by voting to control what laws get made would be part of that. So that would be one. Not being manipulable by internal choice is one way in which an institution can fail to be just. And I haven't given any, way of balancing these off against one another. I just say about coercion. I think that this is something else that got dropped out of my paper. That you might think that coercion is the thing that marks the difference between political philosophy and moral philosophy. But I want to say, look, coercion is downstream from the idea of the importance of having an institution, and it's important, it's not going to work unless it's stabilized, and having it is sufficiently important that provided certain internal requirements are met, it's okay to stabilize it by using a threat of certain kinds of penalties. First you got to get to the idea of justifiable institutions, and then the question of whether they can be stabilized, particular ones can be stabilized by the use of force through certain procedures, is, as it were, part of the package that you have to justify those institutions. But it's, as it were, down. You're already in political philosophy when you're talking about whether we have a duty to comply with these institutions before you get to the question of what's legitimate to do in order to stabilize them.
Frank?
Tim, this is a follow-on to what I thought was the very good question you were asked earlier about your budding deviation from Rawls on the question of the focus on the basic structure.
Right.
So the idea is that the basic structure is composed in part of a set of norms that will be put in place that will impose requirements and limitations on the more concrete policymaking and lawmaking that will take place under the aegis of that basic structure.
Right.
And the basic structure itself won't be judged to be just unless those norms are what they ought to be, right?
Right.
Then it seems there are two possibilities down the line as we move from the constitutional stage to the legislative and judicial stages. Either those norms that are part of the basic structure will be complied with, in which case the practice is in force, but there doesn't seem to be any reason to be concerned about its sufficient proximity to justice.
Sorry, did you repeat that? The first possibility is?
The first possibility is that the basic structure's norms that control more concrete lawmaking will be complied with.
The voting system, the legislative procedures, and so on.
Yeah, and the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, okay, got it.
And property laws.
Right, okay.
And so forth.
Okay, they're just.
We, at the level of the basic structure, we judge them to be sufficiently just.
Right.
If they are complied with in the concrete lawmaking and policy making and law enforcement and administration that ensues, then it would seem that the practice which is in force would itself be sufficiently just because they're complying with the set of norms to control those practices that we judged to be sufficiently just. If, on the other hand, they're not complied with, then the practice is not in force, and the duty of compliance, the natural duty of compliance, doesn't come into play. So the question is, what's the problem? Now, it could be this, that the norms that compose a part of the basic structure and that are supposed to control the more concrete work that gets done later are necessarily cast at a level of relative abstraction. And there will be disagreement, differences of interpretation and disagreement about whether they are in fact being complied with later. Controversies over affirmative action and abortion, I suppose, would exemplify the operation of disagreement and divergence of interpretation of that kind. If we think that there is something called reasonable disagreement, i.e., that some of that disagreement falls within the category of reasonable disagreement, we might think that any interpretation or application of the basic structure norms that falls within the range of reasonable disagreement is close enough to be legitimate,
Okay.
even if not just, right?
Right.
So what I want to suggest here is that perhaps the trick that you referred to is somewhere in the neighborhood of this idea of reasonable disagreement, right? We console ourselves that all is well in the move from the basic structure, which has got norms that we think are just fine, to the level of concrete application with this idea that that there's a range of reasonable disagreement within which the deviations from justice won't be so great as to raise a question of legitimacy. But the main gist of the question is, given that the basic structure consists of norms, and that those norms either will be enforced and complied with at later stages or not, and if they're not, then the practice is not enforced, so the duty to comply is not enforced, what's the problem?
So there wouldn't be any conflict between what I was saying and Rawls if that were the case. I think that diagnosis may be right, but I don't want to say that it's reasonable disagreement that's causing the problem. I think the problem is you think of I think the problem is caused by one of the trick, I want to call it, by one of two things. Either we imagine that, well, I think this isn't quite right, but I'll come back to the other possibility. We imagine that our dearly beloved basic structure is just, but in fact, the way in which actors within it are behaving doesn't involve taking seriously its norms. It's not that they're disagreeing. I mean, the problems of poverty and racism and so on that we see in the country aren't the result of reasonable disagreement about how the norms involve, right? I don't think. But when we think of the institutions as being just, we're imagining that we're prescinding from that. But that's not right. What I said was in my original statement, early in the paper, I said, look, even if the institutions aren't fully just, even if we take seriously the fact that, look, we'd like to think that our institutions are uniquely just, but in fact, they're not. They're not close. The person sitting next to you is quite right that we need a new constitution. But nonetheless, I said, we don't think that it's okay for people simply not to obey the law. So that was the thing I said early in the paper. And then later, I said, well, but when some institutions are unjust, maybe it is okay for people not to obey the law. So the way you're putting it is the kind of opposite of that. You're saying, how might we get from just institutions to a case of results that actually aren't just? Whereas I was saying, look, we all think that even the basic institutions, they're flawed, right? And there's a problem, but still we think we ought to obey the law. But then later, I was driven to at least partially take that back in some cases. And the trick I was worried about was how to explain that flip in intuitions.
So we have one final question, Arthur.
So Tim, this is also on the trick that you are playing on yourself. On your self-account, you begin by just supposing that there's got to be some daylight between just institutions and legitimate institutions, and then you worry that there actually isn't any daylight; it's starting to collapse. And of course, we know a lot about justice, but you just without much argument, just suppose that the property of legitimacy is the property of generating moral obligation to comply, and just maybe it's just wider or more complicated than that. I mean, I think you're absolutely right.
I know. I've read your recent article about this.
Okay, so that we can save ourselves a lot of time. Are you going to reply? No. Okay. So
Not everybody has. So go ahead.
I'll briefly restate it. So it's possible that the property of legitimacy is a moral power. It's a power to change the normative circumstances of the people who it applies to. But the moral power of creating moral obligation is simply one of these moral powers, and maybe in the situations that you're talking about, a legitimate institution does have the moral power to create complicated social facts. Institutional facts has the moral power to create permissions, has the moral power to impose liabilities that would lead to enforcement, but doesn't always have the moral power to create moral obligations. So it's worthy of certain kinds of respect in certain kinds of ways by certain kinds of people, but not the gold standard of respect, which is that you always have a moral obligation to comply with the law. So if you just loosen the entailment relation between legitimate institutions and obligation, maybe you can reestablish the daylight that you want.
Yeah, okay. I would have brought in your paper, except as David Wilkham said, mine was already complicated, and yours is much more complicated than mine. And I agree with you that legitimacy involves more of these things, and I didn't want to say, look, there's nothing to what the state commands. Obviously, a lot of laws, I said, ought to be obeyed, and a lot of these powers are legitimate powers. Actually, focusing on enforcement, though, I think in the case of the laws that I was saying, I thought people might not be justified in breaking. I also think we wouldn't be justified in enforcing. So I don't think that my argument doesn't simply have to do with the obligation to obey.
Okay, please join me in thanking Tim once again. And